grids do is they allow for communication, they allow for frequency transmission and broadcasting, but they also they can fire, which means they'll pop and create little black holes along the whole grid that would connect. See, these were put in with the purpose of, when the stellar activation cycle came, to activate and fire them all, which would create a whole series of little black holes, kind of like, you know how when a needle runs across a piece of fabric from like a sewing machine needle, it leaves all those little holes. Well, if you do enough of those holes, that whole piece will fall right into the phantom matrix. That's what they were created for. The ones that the Guardian races created were meant to work differently. They were meant to create pillars of sound that would anchor our grids into the grids of inner Earth, parallel Earth, and another time matrix called the Miage zone system, which is another one that interfaces here only sometimes, to give us pillars of energy that would allow us to not get pulled down into phantom. So they begin to activate. The Zetas begin to activate in the 1930s their Falcon APIN system. Also in the 30s, they begin to assist to more fully organize Hitler's Nazi movement. They had a vested interest. They could do some interesting things with the Hitler guys. Well, one of the first things they wanted to do was to get rid of certain races that were competing. I'm getting tired. The races they were most interested in getting rid of were a certain group that had been very loyal to the Anunnaki Illuminati, and that they wouldn't go into the Zeta contracts. And these guys were Hebrew. They were passed off as Hebrew, but they weren't Hebrew people. They were Hybiru. They were the Hybiru race lines. Now, hiding under the guise of Hebrew, you have real Hebrew people, which were angelic humans. You have Hyksos, false Hebrew people, which were one of the hybrid lines from the Anunnaki side. And you have Hybiru that has both Anunnaki and Drak family lines in it. What the Zetas wanted done was to get rid of a whole bunch of the Hybiru and the Hyksos lines of what appeared to be the Jewish population, but to leave the ones that were the Draconian lines. And for a while, that was going on. As we moved through this period, we're going into World War and everything. I'll go down to here, because we have stuff to do in here that just blew my mind when I found out about what the whole Japanese thing was really about. Down here, but first we had in the 30s, the Zetas and the Drak agendas were assisting Hitler. Down here, by the time we kind of moved into the 40s, Hitler started to make double deals because the Necromaton and Dramies approached him. And they started to promise him that they would lead him to ancient relics, the Templar prizes. And they did. They showed him some stuff. They gave him some stuff, and that's still buried out there someplace. The Nazis actually had some of the ancient relics from Atlantis, because they used Necromaton and Dramies used them for barter to convince Hitler and his group to do some double dealing for them. And what the Andramis wanted was, since you're getting rid of all these people, why don't you get rid of those Drak families too, the ones that the Zetas wanted protected? So Hitler started to do that on behalf of the Andramis, because the Andromedes were paying him with some knowledge, mystical knowledge, and some of the relics from Atlantis. So this didn't settle really well with the Zetas. They got very upset, in fact. So they worked with the Allies to make sure Hitler was taken down. What was interesting before that, when the Draks were assisting Hitler, one of the ways they were assisting him was having the Illuminati in the Allied countries finance the Hitler movement. Literally, the United States Illuminati, the European Illuminati. While we're fighting these guys, the Illuminati guys are taking money from us and giving them to them to keep their movement going. So this is some of the sleight of hand that's been going on, with our politics. What was really bizarre was what happened with the whole, the Pearl Harbor leading to Hiroshima and all of that thing. What happened with this was at the points where in the 1930s the Zetas were expanding and activating their Falcon APIN system. Now this APIN system had some major sites that were more important than others, that had primary links that were stronger and larger than some of the smaller ones. One of the biggest ones and most important ones, if they were going to completely spread their, activate their matrix around the globe, was located in Nagasaki, Japan. Interestingly, not Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And because the Necrometon and Dramies were getting a little nervous at this point, because the Dracs had come in, the Zetas on behalf of the Dracs had come in, they'd literally gotten control of the Illuminati World Management Team, and they were starting to get control of the grids. And the Andramis didn't like that too much. It was becoming a nuisance and a problem. So the Necrometon were going to build bases. One of them was going to be beneath, like in the waters around and beneath Nagasaki, so they could set up their own sonic system and block the Zetas from further activating the full Falcon grid. That didn't settle very well with the Zetas. They were also, the Necrometon were also going to put a base over in Hawaii, in the Hawaiian waters, and they were going to control certain networks on the Falcon through the ley line grids by having these bases here. They were going to stop the Falcon from fully spreading its wings. Well, that was the agenda the Necrometon had at the moment anyway. So what was done was a interesting little deal where the Zeta groups approached their Illuminati races, because they had collectives here, they had collectives in Japan, they have them all over the place. It's not one nationality, has Zeta races and another has an Anunnaki. There are dominant ones, but really they're scattered throughout. So the Zetas approached both the Japanese Illuminati and the United States Illuminati. They told them what was going to go down. They told Japan to invade, to give us an excuse to go into the war. We knew, certain levels of our Illuminati knew that was coming. In fact, there were even messages sent when those fleets were coming in. They were spotted, they were seen by U.S. troops, and the information was sent back. But it was received, but it was never acknowledged having been received. So we got a surprise attack.
That's in the case of New York, too.
What do you mean?
There were 9 messages.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I didn't even talk about that yet. So we have this situation, this drama created. The purpose of the drama was the Zetas, who were in power at the time for the Drac agenda, mobilized their Illuminati on both sides of the game to create a war game so they could, at one point, first of all, they stopped the Necrometon from building a base over in the Hawaiian area because there was so much scrutiny at that point and so much military presence in that point. They weren't going to be able to quietly build an underground base without getting spotted. So they weren't able to build the Necrometon weren't able to build their base off the coast of Hawaii. And that led to, after some other fancy dealings with other countries like Hitler and things like that, it led to, this was what they really wanted to do. The Necrometon had succeeded to some degree in sealing off the Nagasaki port interface that went with the Falcon Matrix. They didn't fully have a base there yet, but they'd started to build one, and they had what's like a frequency fence or cloaking shield. Now, if that cloaking shield was on there, the Zetas couldn't activate it. So they had to get something big enough and powerful enough, and they didn't have the grids fully activated yet to do the sonics the way they do now. If they were going to get that sonic power in the grids, they had to have all of these online. But if you drop a nuclear bomb on top of one of them, it tends to leave a weakness in those kind of fields that will allow mild sonics, which they did have access to shatter it. So they went after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was very interesting. It had a whole little collective of Necrometon and Drami Illuminati hybrid races, but the majority of the populations of Hiroshima were of the U-race descent. They were Magi Grail Line Indigos that were grid guardians, and they wanted to get rid of those and get rid of the competing Illuminati while they were at it. So they took out Hiroshima, but what they were really after was Nagasaki, because they needed to get that bomb dropped on those sites to weaken the force field that was over their port interface system, so they could then use the mild sonics they had available to completely flatten the force field so they could activate that site and get their supersonic waves available. What they've done by activating the full matrix of the Falcon, they were harnessing the power of being able to create targeted unnatural disasters, earthquakes. I mean, Alaska has been since the 30s, and like moving especially up into the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This was like testing ground. They were using all sorts of sonics up there to see if they could target earthquakes, how far they could get. if you ever look at the information, like just, that's on record as far as the earthquakes up in the Alaska area, there was Alaska, they went for certain desert areas, then they started go for population areas when it became time to start reducing populations, because they knew that for the year 2000 to 2008, when their invasion was scheduled to go, if the stargates were going to open, which they didn't know until 1998, nobody was absolutely certain if the frequencies in the grids would be enough to actually trigger what's called grounding of the stellar bridge. That is when certain frequencies start to come down from the higher dimensional gates, and if there's a compatible frequency in Earth's core, they will latch together, and that's what starts the cycle, the stellar activation cycle. It wasn't until 1998 that anybody knew for sure if it was actually going to go into full stellar activation, but everybody had their troops in position by that time. So all through, literally, from the periods of time when World War II was orchestrated as a territorial conquest and competition between who was going to get what grids activated, it went into series of several types of testing. Now, still throughout this time, the Zetas, on behalf of the Draconian Agenda, were doing population reduction experiments to see, okay, when it got closer to 2000, what would they use to really, take them out. And the idea was to take them out without getting the surface people all stirred up, because the last thing any of them wanted was for us to realize there was an invasion taking place, because there was enough of us to do something about it. And you had the Guardian groups trying like heck to try to get in here and communicate with any of us. If we started to realize from this level there was an invasion taking place, the Guardians might just get an in and somebody might listen if they could get through to them telepathically or something. So it was always had to be kept hush-hush, make sure the general populations don't know, most of the military and governments don't know. Only head echelons in the Illuminati have had the privilege of knowing that we've had ETs here for 70 years. Okay? So it progressed from World War II drama. Let's see. In 1943, this was after like the war stuff had, begun to cool down. 1943, there was something called the Philadelphia experiment was launched. All right, this was done on August 12th, 1943, and if you'll notice in a lot of things, August 12th comes up all the time. August 12th is an important time in relation to how frequency works in the planetary grids. It's called a magnetic peak point. What that means is the planetary magnetic Merkaba spins at its fastest during that time. I think it starts around the 8th of August. It hits its climax point at the 12th, and then is still at a peak until I think about the 15th. So there's usually activity. If they're going to do sonics or anything and they need to amplify them, these are the periods of time that they use. August 12th. Montauk was done August 12th. All right, there has been, August 12th all along has been a point in time when if there were going to be sonics used in the grids that had to have an extra kick behind them, that's when we do them. That's why the dimensional blend experiment of 2003 was scheduled for August 12th, 2003. That was supposed to be the last phase. First you had Philadelphia experiment. That did one thing. What the Philadelphia experiment did was it took the Falcon wormhole, which already had some of its APIN systems activated, and it blew open smaller wormholes in the Philadelphia area. These were areas that were already spiked. They were parts of the Falcon grid that had been put in Atlantis, but they were larger holes. They were wormholes that you could actually use. You could literally go from that wormhole directly into Phantom instead of having to go from the port interface site down back to the main wormhole and in. So these were like direct smaller holes that would lead in. They did the Philadelphia experiment, and what they did in the Philadelphia experiment is they got literally the whole East Coast lineup in. They activated all of those grids, which ran from Portland, I think Portland, Maine, all the way down through Boston, down through New York City. All of our major cities have been built along these lines. It wasn't an accident. They were built along these lines because concentrations of populations were needed there, because that's the areas where you need to run the frequency through the DNA templates to have the most effect. So they would set up, literally, the places where major civilizations were going to take place to make sure concentrations of bodies were going to be on those grids. All right, so by the time we did the 1943 experiment, this really gave them an extra, the Zetas an extra, they were really in control of things at this point, because they had control of most of the grids. The other matrices, the Falcon matrix and the other competing APIN systems, weren't activated yet. And the Anunnaki still had part of their advantage. They had the Nibirian Dadic crystal grid and they had the net, but they were progressively losing control of the sites that they used to have everything under control through the net, they couldn't use that anymore because progressively the Zetas the Falcon Matrix was getting control over the 24 crystal temple sites that I've talked about, the Nibiruum crystal temple sites. They're getting control over the grids. So this was starting to create an issue. Now that the Dracs had come in on behalf, the Zeta Regalians on behalf of the Drac agenda, they had come in, and all of a sudden the Anunnaki realized they weren't getting as far as they wanted to as fast. They thought it would be an easy kill. They thought they'd come in here and just get rid of some, troublesome Illuminati groups that belonged to the Dracs and belonged to the Necromaton, and then they'd just, saunter in and take the place. It wasn't going to go that way because of what happened in the 30s and 40s. Now, in 1951, the Necromaton Andromes begin to make deals with the Jehovian Anunnaki. Now usually Necromaton don't want to talk to anybody, and the Jehovians don't either, so they had something in common. They didn't like anybody else but themselves. So they decided to make a deal, because they're watching this happen. They're watching the Dracs take over, and they don't like the other Anunnaki groups, so they're thinking, by the time we're supposed to activate our APIN systems, we're not going to be able to activate them. They're going to take them over. So there were deals made between the Necromaton Andromes and the Dove Matrix, which are the ones that were associated with the Enoch teachings before, the Jehovian bipedal dolphin people of Sirius A, Arcturus, and Trapezium Orion. All right. So the Necromaton Andromes had already gotten control. Like this happened right before, this happened in Atlantis, right before the fall of Atlantis. Our grid that was called the Golden Eagle APIN system, that was taken over because the temples it was controlled from were taken over by Necromaton Andromes races then. They had literally held control of our Golden Eagle grid, and they called it the White Eagle, kind of like thumbing their nose at us that, oh, we're the Christos Eagle now. These are the false Melchizedek priesthood guys. And most of them, a lot of them anyway, are Nephilim, which were, if anybody's read Voyagers Volume 2, the original copy, we talked about Nephilim as being a race that during seeding 2 of the angelic human lineage here, there had been Anunnaki invasions, and they came in and they forced themselves on women here, and they created a race of, in the Bible they're called a race of giants because they were much larger than regular humans. And the Nephilim were kicked off this planet by the guardian races, and they were like sent to Nibiru and wherever the heck else they wanted to go, but they weren't allowed to be here anymore after we got the territories back at the beginning for seeding 3. So there were all sorts of treaties even then that were going down. This is a very long history of war that we're part of. So these guys make deals. You have Necromaton Andromes that have their White Eagle grid, and you have the Jehovian Anunnaki with their Dove grid. So this is where you have the eagle flying with the dove. All right, these are these deals. They started in the 1950s. What they wanted to do was they wanted to be able to open the Phoenix wormhole. That was the one that was positioned below the Falcon wormhole, right, literally on the same vertical, but right below it, the one that's right off the coast of Florida, where the other one's right off the coast of South Carolina, up a little bit from it. These guys over here. So these guys wanted to open this wormhole because this one was already open, and that's the Falcon one that the Zeta guys were using. So they wanted to open this one and get their matrices running. If they could get the Phoenix wormhole open, they would be able to start activating the Dove grid and the White Eagle grid. So they could start fighting for dominance of the planetary grids to stop the invasion of the Draconian agenda Zetas. This continued literally through the 50s, through the 60s. The Dracs remained in control till 1972. In 1972, it was getting to the point where all the Anunnaki were freaking out because the Dracs just had such a hold on things, and they were determined that even if they had to help each other, the groups of Anunnaki that don't like each other, they decided, well, if we have to stick together for a little while just to get rid of these guys, we'll do it. What they wanted to do was they wanted to open that wormhole and close the other one. That was what they were hoping to be able to do. Open the Phoenix, close the Falcon, now we've got it. That kind of thing. Meanwhile, we're all by this time, most of us were on Planet and, getting raised and watching things like Leave It to Beaver on television and, being fed this illusion of what life is really about. Well, meanwhile, this chaos is taking place underneath the government. And the same time we're being taught in America, we're being taught the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and we're raised with this wonderful bubble of emotion about being American. You know a song that still just makes me want to cry? or Smackazetta. Is the one that goes, I'm proud to be an American, 'cause at least I know I'm free. Well, at least we thought we were free. You know, there's something horribly sad about that. And I look at the people, a lot of people that get upset with the work that I bring out are people that have been in the military. How can you say that about our government? Wait a minute. Listen to what I'm saying. Most of you guys are good guys that give your life for that American Constitution. I know that. I didn't say you were doing this. You know what I mean? Because there's that reaction. America meant something. Conceptually, at least, we were led to believe in America, that this was the land of the free and the home of the brave, and we stood for freedom and justice and rightness. And what is so sad is that's what the people stand for, but it hasn't been the reality of what's been taking place in the governments. So meanwhile, we go and worry about who we're going to vote for next November, and we worry about, watch those returns and see who's going to be the politician up there, when it hasn't mattered since the 1930s. Because you're going to have one of two choices. You're going to have Drac, or you're going to have Anunnaki candidate. Pick one. What does it matter? They both want to take over the place. And the people who are the candidates don't know that. Okay, the people who end up playing the puppets to this, they don't know what they're playing the puppet to. They're doing their roles, we're all doing our roles, and meanwhile, there's these little guys directing things behind the scenes. This is what we've been living. This was like devastating to me when I started to see all the pieces. And what really hit home was when how they explained that since the 30s and progressively through the 40s, 50s, and in the 60s it even increased, where the Draconian races, the Zeta races on behalf of the Draconians, were progressively playing with technologies to take out large numbers of humans without being detected as the ones who did that. They created ethnic viruses that were to go after just specific types of people, races that had certain gene codes where they wouldn't affect others, but they would affect those. Indigos were on the list. Humans were on the list. Illuminati, only competing types, were on the list. All right. They were using targeted sonics to create earthquakes, to create natural disasters, to see how far they could go with it. This was all being done covertly. And some of the military people that found out that things like this were actually going on and tried to do something about it vanished conveniently. They would be taken out.